morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Katie Perez, and I am a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about options for E-2 visas with lower investment amounts and businesses often considered high risk, such as real estate, equity trading firms, and consulting businesses. So, just a few things before we get started. Some of you may know that our firm was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the US on an E-2 visa and has been on several different visas, including an F1, a TN, B, and an H-1B. Scott Legal PC is a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer immigration services in several different areas, including E-2, E-1, TN, L-1, family immigration, national interest waivers, EB-5, extraordinary ability visas, and more. We have processed hundreds of E-2 visas, and we typically process E-2 visas that are considered higher risk, such as those with lower investment amounts. We have processed at consulates around the world, but our primary two consulates are Toronto and London. So we will continue this webinar series doing at least 2 webinars a week on different topics. At the end of this webinar, we will send out several useful tools. We will send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation from today, a link where you can download guides that go through the visa options in more detail, and also a link where you can sign up for additional webinars. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on YouTube. We will also send the link for that. We encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly upload immigration videos on a wide variety of topics. We'll also send you a link where you can arrange a consultation with one of our experienced immigration attorneys if you would like to discuss your case in more detail. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat box and we will address them at the end of the presentation. So today I will be presenting the first half of the webinar, and we are also lucky to have our partner, Kelly Weiner. She will be here to present the last half of the webinar. Kelly is a partner here at Scott Legal. She has extensive experience working with E-2s, especially those that are considered higher risk. So without further delay, we will get started with the webinar. Okay. So first, we'll just start out by discussing what are the E-2 visa requirements. In order to be eligible for the E-2 visa, you must be a national of a treaty country. This means you need to hold a passport from an E-2 treaty country. The Department of State has a list available on their website of these E-2 treaty countries. Occasionally, the list is updated with additions and changes, but currently there are over 80 different countries listed. So as I stated, you need to be a holder of a passport from an E-2 treaty country. However, you don't need to have been born in an E-2 treaty country. For example, if you are born in India, but you hold a passport from India, but your parents were born in Australia and they have Australian citizenship, and you got your citizenship from your parents with Australia, and you hold an Australian passport, you could be eligible for the E-2 visa based on your nationality requirement, even if you've never been to Australia. So the fact that you have an Australian passport means you satisfy this nationality requirement. Another requirement is that you must own 50% of the E-2 visa company. The business can take on almost any form. It could be an LLC or a corporation, but you need to own at least 50% of that company. So you can own exactly 50%, you can own 100%. However, you can't own 49%. The moment that your ownership drops below this 50% mark, then you actually become ineligible for the E-2. So if you're thinking later on about selling equity in the company, it's very important to keep this in mind, that you need to continuously meet the eligibility requirements of the E-2 visa the entire time you hold the visa. So therefore, you need to continue that ownership at least 50% or more in the E-2 company. This also means you could have at least 2 E-2 investors supported by one E-2 company. So as an example, if you have the Italian passport and you have a friend who holds an Australian passport, and you both want to go into a company, this E-2 venture, if you each own 50% of the company, then you could each apply as E-2 investor visa. So you would each have to satisfy all the requirements of the E-2 visa, but it is certainly possible to have 2 E-2 investors who own 50% of the same company, with each investor having an E-2 visa. So another requirement is that you must make a substantial investment in the business. A common question we get is, how much do I need to invest in a business and what is substantial? So unfortunately, there is no exact dollar figure for the E-2 visa. But in general, when trying to determine what is a substantial investment, you should first consider what amount is sufficient to make this business fully operational. So consider, have you purchased everything you would need to make this business fully operational and functional? For example, do you have the equipment, the lease, the inventory, the licenses, everything you need to go ahead and run this business? But it is important to keep in mind that every business is different. So, for example, if you were going to open a consulting company, this would require less investment, less money to make the company fully operational than a manufacturing plant. So, after considering what you would need to make this business fully operational, there's another consideration. You would also want to consider, have I invested a minimal amount in the eyes of the government officer to be considered substantial? So, for example, if you were going to open this consulting company and you could make it fully operational for $5,000, this wouldn't necessarily meet the requirement. The government would likely say this is not a substantial investment. So as there is a second step to the analysis when kind of considering the investment amount and what is substantial. So as mentioned, the first step is kind of thinking, have I invested enough to make this company fully operational? The second step would be, have I invested a minimal amount in the eyes of the government officer? So generally, we recommend to our clients that you invest at least $50,000. But again, it really does depend on the type of business. And it can also depend on where you're applying, which consulate you're at. Another requirement, something to think about, is your funds must be at risk. This means that it's not enough to simply set up the business bank account for an E-2 company and transfer funds into that bank account. The funds must be spent. So if you transfer $100,000 from your personal bank account into this E-2 bank account, you would need to show that you then spent those funds on things to make your business fully operational. So again, as an example would be your lease or the inventory, the equipment, marketing fees, legal fees, things you would need to set up the E-2 business. So you want to show the officer that you've bought everything that the business needs to be fully operational. So you can have a certain amount reserved in your bank account, the E-2 business bank account, as working capital. For example, if you had $100,000 as your investment transferred to the E-2 business bank account and you've spent 75 to 80% of those funds, but you have about $25,000 remaining in the bank account as working capital, we would still say the total investment is $100,000, and we would say the remaining $25,000 would be there for working capital. So you still need to show that you've spent most of the funds, but it is permissible to have some of the funds remain as the working capital. So you have to remember you can't just transfer the funds and let them sit there and not spend the funds. You need to commit those funds to the E-2 company. So we also have the source of funds. The government needs to be satisfied that the source of your funds was lawful and legitimate. The scope of what is acceptable is quite broad. You can use gifts from friends or family, and you can use loans as long as the loans are not secured by your personal assets of the E-2 company. You can use inheritance. You can use income earned over the course of several years. The government is accepting of a lot of different sources as long as you can show that the funds were lawful and legitimate. So we do emphasize that the government can have a high documentation requirement to satisfy that the funds were lawfully acquired. You do need to make sure that you have documents showing exactly where you obtained those funds from. So this is especially the case if you're inside the US and you're applying for the E-2 with USCIS. USCIS can be very strict about the source of funds and the documentation requirement. Conversely, most consulates do have a page limit, so they are less strict about the source of funds. However, even if you were to apply at a consulate, it is really important to be able to show documentation, if requested, where those funds were obtained from, and you should be able to explain the trail of the funds. So how much is enough? We will also talk about this later on in the presentation, but you would want to keep in mind really what type of business are you starting? What are the reasonable startup costs associated with that business? You need to consider the type of business and what does the business need to really make it fully operational. So typical E2 expenditures generally include inventory, equipment, website setup, office supplies, office warehouse rent, marketing, business entity setup, those types of things. When you're considering what type of expenditures to include, you should again consider what is needed to make this business fully operational. If needed, you would want to show the government the business has purchased everything needed to make this business operational tomorrow. So if you're starting a restaurant, do you have your health licenses? Do you have things if you're going to sell alcohol? Do you have your alcohol license, that sort of thing? You need to show that you've either paid for those licenses or you're applied for them, those types of things. So let's see. There's also the requirement called the marginality requirement, which means that the business must support more than just the investor and their family. The way this really translates is that you must show that you're going to hire U.S. workers to work at the U.S. business. So if you've purchased a business, you could, even if you've purchased business, you'll also show that you'll still employ the U.S. workers. So we typically recommend that the business employ at least three full-time U.S. workers within 5 years of starting the business operations. This is a broad statement and it won't apply to every single business, but again, you really need to consider the type of business. But generally, if the E2 business can employ three full-time U.S. workers, then the company is not going to have issues at renewal based on the marginality requirement. Three full-time U.S. workers within 5 years of starting operations is a good baseline to keep in mind. The earlier you can start hiring, the better. And if you can start hiring even before you have submitted the application, that will strengthen the application. So again, since we're talking about riskier, lower investment applications, a consideration for your investment funds could be to use some of the funds to hire a U.S. worker early on. This can help the officer see that in spite of the low investment amounts, this is a company that is likely to employ U.S. workers because you already have an employee. If you're able to show the officer that you've already hired U.S. workers, then other parts of the application will become less important than the low investment amount. So even um, if you show, you have a really high investment amount, but you're not planning on hiring U.S. workers, then this would be you haven't met this requirement. So it is really important to hire those U.S. workers. The other requirement is that the business must be real and operating. The business does not need to be operating before you submit the application. What this requirement is really telling you that once you arrive in the US to work at this E2 company, you're ready to begin operating the business. So again, you need to show the officer that you've bought everything the business needs to be operational, and you need to have proof that you've taken all the necessary steps to begin operating the business. So things you can include in the application would include a commercial lease, showing that you have the office space, proof that you have all the necessary equipment, that you've paid for it. You can include contracts if you have those already with some clients. Maybe you've already begun to sell your products or provide services. If you have payroll records, for any employees that you may have, this would also be good to include. You can also show letters of interest from prospective clients. That can also be persuasive to help support your application. You really just want to think about what can I show the officer to that I'm very serious about the business and that you're already getting traction. So you must also be coming to the US to solely develop and direct the E2 enterprise. This means you, as the E2 investor, will be coming to really develop and direct this business. You, as the owner, this is the only thing you're going to be doing permitted in the US. So you're not, with the E2 visa, you're not going to be able to come work for a different company. You're not going to be able to have a side gig or side job. You're really coming here to work at that specific enterprise with the focus on directing and developing that business. So you do need to be qualified to direct and develop the business. But just because you haven't worked in the industry doesn't mean that you would not be qualified. Generally, this is a really low bar. It would require an explanation. If you can provide the explanation, connect the dots for the officer to show how you would be qualified to direct and develop the business, then you should be able to satisfy this requirement. Again, you do need to show that you have ownership of at least 50% of the business. Um, the screen says ownership of greater than, but however, it is just 50% is sufficient. Um, you need to have control of the business. You need to be able to make the business decisions. On another note, so this really does apply with the USCIS applications. You need to be careful and keep in mind that you don't want to look like you're the sole employee of the business for a period of time. It is important to show you will have other workers who will be performing kind of the day-to-day duties or the duties dealing with customers. Because again, you do want to show the government that you're here to direct the business and develop. Um, Again, because if you're the employee providing the services to customers, then this means you're oftentimes competing with the domestic labor market. USCIS cares a lot more about this than the consulate. But for example, if you're here in the US as an F1 and you've just earned your degree in accounting and you want to start an accounting firm with the E-2 visa, a risky application would be to apply through USCIS to start this accounting firm with no plans to hire other accountants for maybe 2 years. So USCIS would assume, you're here to perform those accounting services. That would be risky because you'd be competing with people in this domestic labor market. So to really strengthen your application, it would help to be clear from the beginning that you are going to hire even a part-time accountant and have this person on your payroll, and that accountant would be providing the accounting services. And then again, you would be here really to direct and develop the E-2 enterprise. So you need to also have the intent to return to your home country upon the expiration of the E-2 visa. The E-2 visa is not a green card and does not lead to permanent residency. It's a temporary non-immigrant visa, which means you're allowed to enter the U.S. for a temporary period of time to accomplish a specific purpose. So in this case, that would be to direct and develop this E-2 enterprise. So that does not mean you can't come to the US with the E-2 visa without the intent to renew. You can intend to renew the visa. You can even intend to later on get the green card. It just really means when you enter the US initially with that E-2 visa, your intent is to come work at the E-2 enterprise to direct and develop it, but not to initially get that green card. It's fine if your plans change later on. But applying for that green card cannot be the intent when you actually enter the US. So next, under the E-2 visa, you can either start, you do have a few different options. You can start a new business, or you can even purchase an existing business, or you can even start a franchise. All three are fairly common and all three work really well under the E-2 visa. If you're buying a business, a couple things to keep in mind. One, if the business has been fully operational for a few years, then do look at a business that already has a few US workers. If you're buying a business that has been operational, but it doesn't have any employees, or maybe it only has one, you are creating a hurdle for yourself because you're going to have to explain to the officer how you're going to overcome that. Again, we mentioned the marginality requirements. You want to show that you are going to hire US workers. So it is easier or beneficial if you can find a business where it already has these US workers. Franchises can also be a good option because you often have the infrastructure of the franchise to support you. If you're going to buy a business and you're concerned about putting a significant amount of money on the line for the business, one option you do have is called escrow. Escrow is the one exception to the requirement that your investment needs to be at risk. Previously, we said it's not enough to just put your money in a bank account and let it sit there, that you need to spend the funds. So the one exception would be that you could put your funds in this escrow account under the condition that those funds will be released from escrow to the seller of the business immediately upon issuance of the visa. So the issuance of the E-2 visa is that one condition. If you have any other conditions on the escrow, then this is not going to be accepted by the government. But if that one condition is once I get the visa, the funds will be released, then generally that's fine and can put people's minds at ease when they're putting a lot of money on the line. Okay, so I'll also discuss a little bit about how long the E-2 visa is valid. The validity dates of the E-2 visa can vary from 3 months to 5 years, and the amount of time you get depends on the agreement the U.S. has with this E-2 treaty country, the country that you have the passport from. So you should keep in mind that even if you were eligible for the 5-year visa, the officer who is approving or adjudicating your petition, they do have discretion to limit the length of the visa. So reasons they may limit the length of the visa could just be depending on the strengths and weaknesses of the case. So an officer could ask you to return to the consulate within 3 years rather than 5 because they really do want to see if you're meeting the eligibility requirements of this E-2 visa. So once you have the visa, the valid visa means you can seek entry into the U.S. When an E-2 investor enters the U.S., CBP will issue you what is called the I-94. For E-2 status holders, this I-94 typically grants the 2 years of authorized stay. And each time you enter the U.S. in valid E-2 status, generally CBP will issue you the I-94 with the 2 years of the authorized stay. The I-94 is independent of the visa stamp expiration dates in many cases. So while in the U.S., under this E-2 status, the I-94 serves as proof that you are authorized to be in the U.S. and that you are authorized to work for the E-2 company. As long as the I-94 admit date is still valid, it hasn't expired, then you're legally allowed to remain and continue working for the qualifying E-2 business. So each time you leave and re-enter the U.S. with this valid E-2 visa, CBP will typically issue you a fresh two-year I-94, again, extending your ability to work and remain in the U.S. So regardless of whether your visa was issued for 3 months or 5 years, you do typically get the 2 years of E-2 status from CBP. The moment you leave the US is that moment the E-2 visa validity period becomes relevant. So for example, if you have that 3-month visa, but you entered and you have that 2-year E-2 status given by CBP, then you could stay in the US for 2 years. However, if you want to travel and that 3-month visa has expired, you would then need to return to the consulate to renew that visa. With the 3-month visa, we do see more people often extending with USCIS within the US, this just to avoid having to go back to the consulate. Okay. So we will discuss a little bit of just how much is enough. So we touched upon this at the beginning of the presentation, but again, the law doesn't have a specific defined dollar amount for the E-2 visa, unlike something like the EB-5. The law says you need to invest a substantial amount. So the negative could be that there's not a defined dollar amount and there is some uncertainty, but the positive is that you could get approved for your visa with a fairly low amount. The important thing is to show that you've invested enough in the business to be fully operational, and then showing that you've met this minimal amount in the eyes of the government officer. And then typically, we would recommend that you hit that at least $50,000 mark. But really, you would need to consider the type of business. if you have this manufacturing a plant, again, it would need more than $50,000. If you're doing a consulting business, it would require less. So once you've hit that minimal amount and you've invested enough for the business to be fully operational, we typically don't see the investment amount being an issue. Um, but again, it could depend on the type of business in which consulate you are at. So we've already explained that the money must be spent. The money can't just sit in your business bank account. The investment, it does depend on the type of business you're operating in, again, but you need to plan on spending the money you're investing on related expenditures. The government does have what is called the proportionality test. We won't spend too much time on that, but generally the test compares the amount you've invested to the total cost of the business you are buying or creating. So the question is whether your investment represents a meaningful percentage of what's required to get this business fully functioning and operational. The proportionality test works on like a sliding scale. So the lower cost of a business, it would require a higher percentage of investment. So for example, if you have a business costing about $100,000 to be operational, the government would likely require you to invest close to 100% of that total cost. Conversely, for a higher costing business, it would require a lower percentage of investment. So, a business costing millions of dollars, the government would likely require a smaller percentage for the investment. So a 10 to 15% may be fine for a business costing millions of dollars. Okay. Oops. Okay, so what are some strategies to deal with the low investment amount? The first step would really be to look at your application as a whole. After looking at the application as a whole, you'd really want to try and identify the positive factors of your case. So, for example, do you already have any US workers that have been hired? Do you have contracts? Have you previously run a business like this before abroad? Those would all be positive factors that you would really want to highlight for the adjudicating officer. The investment amount is one requirement of several. So if you have the low investment amount, again, but you have these US workers, this will really strengthen your case. So if you have multiple employees, that would be great. Full-time employees are better than part-time. If you don't have part-time, even independent contractors can help. So all of these options are better than not having any employees to show the officer. Some US workers would really show that you're serious about creating work opportunities for people here in the US. This would be a direct way to show the officer that they shouldn't be concerned about this low investment amount because you are still employing the US workers. Other ways you could show your company is likely to be successful and likely to employ US workers is to show interest in your products or services. You can do this by obtaining the contracts if you are already operational, if you have letters of intent from potential clients. If you're outside the US, you can still even hire a US worker and have the business operate in this capacity. Again, hiring a US worker is a really positive factor. You can obtain a letter from your local chamber of commerce, kind of explaining that this business is needed in the community or would likely be successful in that community. You can even try to get a letter from a certified public accountant, which explains that they've seen businesses of this type and the amount of money invested is generally sufficient to get this business fully operational. You would also want to draft a strong business plan. This is very important regardless of whether or not you have a large investment or a small investment, because the business plan really does show you how you're going to use the funds, generate interest, how you're planning to market your products and services, and employ the US workers. Generally, a business plan kind of lays out what you're going to do beginning with year 1 all the way up to year 5. And really, the business plan helps the officer see how you meet the requirements of the E-2 visa. So we also have some the explanation of the common expenditures for the E-2 visa. So E-2 business expenditures are those expenses that are needed for the business to be fully operational. If the expenditure is needed for the business, then it's usually considered a strong expense. So common expenditures can include a website setup and hosting, things like a computer, printer, scanner, iPads, tablets, inventory, which can be shipped from another country, and does not have to be purchased in the US. Furniture, but only if it's used for business purposes. You don't want to purchase furniture for your house, that would not count. Trademark, intellectual property purchase or development, employee payroll, independent contractor payments, legal fees, a lease. Sometimes clients will prepay for their lease for a few months. Regarding the lease, you can only include payments that you've already paid for. So, also software, advertising, or things like office supplies would also could be considered an expenditure. So now we are going to switch over to our partner, Kelly. She's going to discuss what would be considered some of the weaker expenditures.
Thank you, Katie. Perfect. So we're going to talk about some weak expenditures. I also see that there have been some questions coming in, and we will make time at the end to get to those questions. Um, So for weak expenditures, anything kind of travel related, these are not considered strong expenditures. So flights that you take to the US to set up your business, usually wouldn't be included. If there is some very specific conference, that's very relevant to the kind of setup of the business, that might be able to be included, particularly kind of the conference fee. But even then, just the flights are often not strong expenditures. And for all of these expenditures, one of the risks as well is that they will not only kind of X them out and just kind of not count them in the investment amount, but then it makes them feel like maybe you're kind of padding the investment and you really haven't spent everything necessary to get this particular type of business up and running. So a car or a vehicle. Now this can be a weak or a strong expenditure depending on the type of business that you have. So if you have a business that needs a vehicle, like you have a construction business and the vehicle is going to be used to transport things, or a renovations business, or maybe you have a food truck or a mobile pet grooming business, obviously then a vehicle is going to have to be part of the investment. It's considered a weak expenditure if you are just saying, well, I'm going to buy a car for my personal use and to kind of drive to and from work, or I'm a consultant, I have to kind of drive to my clients, offices, and then it's also my personal car. In those instances, a vehicle is not considered a strong expense. So it's the strongest expense when it's kind of purchased in the name of the company. And solely really used for, commercial reasons. Maybe you even have kind of some branding or marketing that's put on it. So it's clearly a commercial vehicle. Um, Other, kind of weak expenditures would be things like meals, taxis, transportation, entertainment, anything kind of related to kind of business development in that way. You took out a client out for a dinner, or you took them to a show. None of that is really considered to be a strong E2 expenditure, and we wouldn't recommend including it. Also, expenses paid to related parties. So let's say, for example, that you own a company in Germany and they design websites. And so you want your US company to pay your company in Germany to design the website for the E2. So this isn't prohibited. You can do this. But if it were to come to the attention of the officer that, you're basically having one company you own receive the money from the E2 company, they could feel that the funds are not really at risk in the commercial sense and say, well, you're really just paying money to yourself. And the same goes if it's like your spouse or something like that. So again, not prohibited, but not the strongest expenditures either, particularly if it comes to light for the officer. All right, so let's move in to talk about some specific challenges and tips for consulting businesses. So, theoretically, a very low investment is needed to start a consulting business. It's extremely common that we have clients come to us and say, I want the E2, but I don't think I can get it because I really just don't have any money I need to spend. I have a laptop, I have my contacts, in the industry, I have my own expertise I've built over time. I don't need to spend any money. And so while it is true that you might not need to spend any money, from an entrepreneurial business perspective, if you want to get the visa, you do have to make a substantial investment that shows that the officer that you are committed to developing this business in the US. So there's a few different strategies you can take to kind of deal with, these issues. So one is you can kind of look for market research, industry reports, articles that show here's how much it costs to get this particular type of business up and running. And then you're going to point out, I've spent well in excess of that, right? There's maybe, some articles in Entrepreneur Magazine saying you need, 5 to 10,000 to set up a consulting company. To get the E-2, realistically, you're going to have to spend well in excess of 5 to 10,000, but it is helpful to show, hey, this is, a respected business publication, and this is what they're saying it really costs to get everything, up and running, and I've spent, far more than that. Um, you do have to kind of get comfortable with the fact that you will have to make this substantial investment. And so, if you're saying no matter what, I'm just not spending more than 5,000, that's really not going to work out well for the E-2. So you do have to get comfortable with trying to find creative ways to make the investment, in order to get the visa. What we do try to recommend is, we don't want people to just spend money, that they feel is a waste. But you might want to look ahead, maybe 1 to 2 years and think, what would I be spending money on? And maybe try to pull some of those expenditures, forward. So you're spending that money now instead of waiting the 1 to 2 years. This can look like prepaying for commercial office space, so you prepay for some length of time, maybe 6 to 12 months. That can be a large chunk of money. This could look like purchasing equipment. Maybe you have a laptop that works, but you were going to get, a better laptop in a year. Maybe you purchase that laptop now. If you're going to hire employees, maybe you're going to hire 3 employees by year 2. All of those employees will need some type of equipment, computer, phone, printer, tools. Maybe you purchase some of those things for, that employee, at this point instead of waiting. You can also hire an employee. It's not required to hire an employee before you file, but it does strengthen the application. And anything you pay to that employee, including any kind of ancillary expenses related to the employee, like insurance, like a payroll provider, like equipment, all of that, can be included, and those are strong E-2 expenditures. So sometimes people will choose maybe to get, a part-time office assistant to help with some of the initial setup admin, and then anything they pay to that employee can be included in their, in their investment. You do want to spend over a large number of categories. So this goes back to what Katie was talking about with showing that you've spent everything necessary to get this type of business up and running. So, if you make maybe one large expenditure, maybe you spend $30,000 to get a really amazing website and some marketing. And then you spend, $10 on pens. That's going to look like a very lopsided investment. You really need to think about strategically spending in the, several areas that would be relevant. And even for a consulting business, having commercial space, having equipment, having employees, having software, having a marketing plan, all of these are kind of the variety of expenditures that you want to bring in. It would obviously be, it'll depend on the type of business, but for consulting businesses, this is, a very common, approach to use. All right, go to the next slide. Okay, so real estate. So real estate, can have its challenges, partly because there is kind of a misconception that you can just purchase a property, collect rental income, and purchasing the property can be your investment. Even on many consular websites and the FAQs, like they often have a question that says, "Can I purchase a property and use that for my investment?" And the answer is no. So this is just a very common misconception. And when you're going in with a real estate company, you have to know they're going to be kind of already scrutinizing it more closely to make sure, hey, is this a real and operating business? Has the person made a substantial investment? What is it they're going to do? If you're just going to own 1 or 2 properties and have them on Airbnb and collect rental income, that's usually not going to be considered enough to qualify for an E-2. Um, you also have to show that you're going to have enough of a business volume to hire and maintain employees, ideally at least, 3 to 5, by year 5 of operations. So here's some kind of, we've put some ideas here of E2s our clients have done in the past successfully. These include things like a real estate brokerage firm, a real estate property management company. And this can include maybe you own your own properties and you manage them, but maybe then you also have contracts with other, people who own company or who own properties, and you manage those properties as well. Renovation and construction, and also house flipping. But this works best if you're doing it on a large scale. And then obviously, if you're doing a large scale, the investment amount generally will need to be higher because you're purchasing a lot of properties. There's a lot of costs associated with commercial real estate development. A client comes to mind who, had a portfolio of 30 to 40 properties, right? And an investment amount over $1 million. If house flipping is something you want to do, but you don't really have the capital to do it on a large scale yet, you could consider doing something more service-based, like renovation, like property management, and then having house flipping kind of in your business plan as a secondary service that you offer. And this would kind of allow you to say, well, our focus is on property, management, or our focus is on, renovation projects. And we've purchased everything necessary to offer those services. But, as the years go on, or in year 2 or 3, we're also going to incorporate, house flipping as part of the services we offer. And this can sometimes allow you to add that on if you don't really have the capital to do it, on a large scale. And one last thing on real estate, which is just that it's a very regulated industry. And so that means that, for example, if you're going to be a real estate agent, if you're going to be a property manager, or you're going to do construction, oftentimes you need licenses for these types of things. And for some of these things, you may need a social security number, to take a test to get the license. So if that's a situation and you don't have a social security number, you may need to think about maybe having a partnership with a local business where they do have that license, or basically planning for it to show, hey, there's a realistic runway to getting these licenses within a month, once I come to the United States. All right, looking at equity trading companies, very similar considerations to, kind of real estate. So just concerns that it's going to be a passive entity, that you're just going to put your own personal stock portfolio into an LLC, and do day trading or personal investing. So it does need to go beyond that. You have to show there's enough activity, that this is an active business, that you're going to be able to hire U.S. workers. It's also a highly regulated industry. So, for example, if you have a hedge fund, if you're doing certain types of equity trading, you need to show you have the proper licenses and structure to support that, and to show that the company itself is going to generate revenue and be able to hire employees. So you don't want to have kind of an entity that's just passive and doesn't show that operational activity. All right, so let's talk about some reasons for E-2 visa denials. So one would be low investment amount. We've talked about some strategies for dealing with low investment amounts, but there are some investments that are just too low. So again, it comes to mind a client who had $98,000, spent 2,000 and put the rest in a business bank account. Came to us, we were able to advise them. They spent closer to 50,000 with about 50,000 in working capital, and ultimately were approved. So there are just some investments that will just be too low. Nature of the business can be another reason. So we've talked about, real estate, equity trading, consulting. These are areas where you're going to get more scrutiny, and you need to make sure that you have, a really strong application to convince the officer that it's going to be, a viable business. Filing location and venue. So there are some consulates that are more open to these lower investment amounts. I see in the questions, there's a lot of questions about very, very low investment amounts. There's many consulates that really just won't entertain investment amounts this low. Maybe they're used to seeing large multinational companies. This is especially the case in Asia, where they're kind of sending through a lot of employees, and the companies themselves are making very large investments. They may not be as receptive to a small investor who's investing around 60,000. There are some other venues where that is more favorable, which we'll talk about, like U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, doing a change of status if that's available to you, like Toronto, London, Australia. These are posts that are a bit more familiar with kind of the smaller investor, the smaller business owner, and maybe more, willing to accept those investment amounts. But it is important to understand your filing location, your venue, because it does make a big difference. And due to kind of changes In the government in the last year, it has become the case where you can really only apply in the consulate, where in the country where you are either resident or the country where you have a passport, where you're, a citizen. And then if you're in the US in a status that allows it, you could also consider a change of status. So the next two reasons for denials are kind of related, both related to the marginality requirement, which is, will the business create jobs for U.S. workers? Will it support more than just the investor and their family? So, if you've had a business in your home country for many years and you never hired anybody, they may not believe a 5-year business plan that says you intend to hire people because they see your history and the history shows you never hired anyone and you just were a solo consultant for 10 years. In a case like that, it may be that you want to hire somebody before you file the petition. Even though it's not required, it really can help, and kind of address that concern off the bat. So another might be issues with the adjudicating officer. So officers, they're human beings. They have different levels of training. They have different, kind of messages they're getting from the consular chief about, what is acceptable at any given point in time. Although there's nothing in the regulations that says this is a substantial amount. There are, over the years, there have been times where consulates have taken a more rigid view, anything under X amount won't qualify. So if you do feel like you got an officer who was, extremely unfair, you want to be as polite as possible. They have complete discretion over whether to grant or deny the visa. And you can always try to reapply if you were denied. They do usually try to give you a different officer. It's not guaranteed, but they do try. And if you really feel that there was a complete, miscarriage of the law, there's certain kind of things you can do to try to escalate it, but generally your fastest option is going to be reapplying. And the last might be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So let's say you applied with on your own and you didn't own at least 50% of the company, or the entire, investment was, kind of made from revenue from clients as opposed to your personal funds, and none of that can be included as investment. So if that's one of the questions we have on the, which I'll address now, which is that if your company is already operating and it's the US company and it's receiving revenue, you cannot use that for your E-2 investment. If you wanted to use that, what you'd have to do is pay yourself a salary from the company, pay taxes on that salary, and then reinvest that into the company. But revenue from clients into the U.S. company itself does not count as E-2 investment because it's not the investor's personal funds being put at risk. All right, so let's talk about some adjudication trends. Um, Government posted approval rates are between 80 to 90%. Our approval rate is around, 98%, although past results do not predict future outcome. No one can guarantee that your visa is going to be granted. So in terms of timelines, London right now, their timeline is about 90 business days to review, and then you can kind of you're contacted to schedule your interview, which usually you can get within a few weeks. So it is quite a long time right now, several months for them to review any E-2 case. In Toronto, they're reviewing the cases in about 10 to 15 business days. So the case gets submitted, the client gets contacted within about 10 to 15 business days to say, yes, you can go ahead and schedule your appointment. You schedule your appointment. Appointments are available right now about 2 months out from when you're contacted. So this was a change. Previously, appointments were available a bit faster. However, there have been changes at the consulate. They're not allowed to use interview waiver as much. So they're having to interview more people with the same number of officers, and it has led to some delays. When we talk about timelines generally, again, it's very important to know like what is your specific consulate. Some consulates have a review time of 30 days, some have 60 days. So you always want to think in this time scale of months, usually as opposed to kind of days or weeks, and just know kind of where it is that you're applying. Because, for example, if you're applying for a change of status with USCIS, you can pay an additional fee to get a response within 15 business days. That can be an approval, denial, or request for more evidence. And then once you submit the more evidence, they usually issue a final decision, 15 business days after that. So that's, the only place where you can kind of pay an expedite fee to get a specific timing. At the consulates, they don't permit that. So moving into talking about USCIS versus the consulate in terms of filing, so as I just mentioned, USCIS does have this benefit where you can pay an additional fee to get this response within a certain time. However, if you do get this USCIS approval, what it is just a 2-year approval notice that allows you to stay in the United States and work for the E2 company. This is also only available to people who are already in the US and a valid status that allows you to change status. So let's say you entered on ESTA, maybe to open your business bank account and get a commercial office space. You cannot do a change of status from ESTA. So that wouldn't be available to you. But let's say you're here on an H-1B and you want to start your own company, you're interested in that, you could transition from your H-1B to the E-2 through the change of status process. That being said, it is not a visa stamp, doesn't allow you to travel internationally, and it does not with some visas, like an H or an L, you get an approval from USCIS and you take that to a consulate, and they pretty much are going to accept the approval and just evaluate, your admissibility. With the E-2, it's a different situation. Getting an approval from USCIS does not mean the consulate will approve the E-2. The consulate's going to look at the E-2 as a brand new application. So let's say you got an approval through USCIS with $25,000 invested. Even if the company is doing very well, when you go to a consulate, having such a low initial investment amount is still quite risky because the consulate is going to review it as a brand new application, as opposed to relying on the approval from USCIS. So that can be kind of a challenge for USCIS. The other thing with USCIS is they're very detailed on source and trail of funds. So if you have maybe your investment is coming from personal savings from employment and you have tax returns showing you have more than enough income. At a consulate, you can pretty much include the tax returns, the bank statement showing the transfers, and then the proof of the investment. For USCIS, they will actually want to see not just the tax returns, but your payroll summary, your pay stubs, that amount entering your bank account and being maintained there. So if it's a situation where you've transferred the funds to many different bank accounts, or your payroll goes into multiple bank accounts and it's hard to source, USCIS may not be a good option. When In terms of the consulate, the biggest benefit there is for many, treaty country nationals, they can get a multi-year, multi-entry visa. For example, London, Australia, Canada, you can get a 5-year visa, which allows you to kind of grow and expand the company over a longer period of time. They also take a more holistic view, of the source and trail of funds. That being said, USCIS often is more accepting of lower investment amounts if it makes sense in light of the business. So moving to talk about some post-specific considerations, each consular post has kind of their own way they want things done. They will have instructions on their website usually. Sometimes these are very detailed, like certain documents they want, file size limitations, page limitations, and they will be very picky about it and send it back to you. If you send 80 pages and they wanted 70 pages, they might send it back to you. So you do need to pay attention to those. Also, just to be aware of consular preferences, as I discussed, some consulates are more open to small investors, than others. Also, just to be aware that CPA certification of business plans is a trend, not super widespread right now, but there are certain consulates, Singapore, Mexico come to mind, where they do ask that your 5-year business plan include a certification from a CPA who has validated the financials. At Scott Legal, we do offer the service of assisting with drafting your business plan, and we also do have a CPA on staff who can certify the business plan if that's something you need. All right, some complex areas and issues, to keep in mind. Do you have to hire employees before you apply for an E-2? The answer is no. There are some consulates that go through phases where they argue, well, you do have to have that for it to be real and operating. It's not the case. The regulations do make that clear that it's not the case. However, that being said, it's quite, favorable to your case to hire an employee before you apply. So if you do have that ability and you want to do that, it helps on many areas, including marginality, real and operating, and investment amount, because anything you pay to the employee or for the employee, can be included. Complicated source and trail of funds for USCIS filing. So again, If you are filing with USCIS and you have a very complex, source of funds, multiple gifts from multiple people that have sourced it over the years, this can make a USCIS filing much more difficult. Loans are permitted for the E2 to be the source of the investment as long as they are personal loans that are either unsecured or secured on your personal property. They cannot be loans secured by the E2 business itself. This comes up a lot in seller financing situations. Let's say you want to purchase a business from somebody, and you're going to put down 50% of the purchase price and the rest is seller financing. That usually does not work for an E2 because at that point, the seller financing is, that amount of financing is secured by the business. So you've only invested 50%. That likely won't be considered to be a substantial amount. Gifts can be included, but the gift giver has to feel comfortable providing you with the financial documentation to show where they got the money. So you can't kind of get around the source of funds requirement by just getting a gift letter. If you get a gift from your mother, she's going to have to feel comfortable giving you her tax returns or giving you the proof that she sold the property or whatever her source of funds was. E2 visas for two owners. This is permitted. The ownership does have to be 50-50. Substantive changes to the E2 business after filing. So sometimes people will get a visa, a multi-year visa, and they think, great, I can work in the US. And the E2 visa is more restrictive than that. You can work in the US for your E2 company that is doing what you like put forth to the consulate or USCIS. So if there's a change in ownership, you have a US citizen business partner, suddenly they own 70% and you own 30%. Now your visa is really no longer valid. You're not maintaining that status if you don't have, some argument for operational control of the company. Um, Similarly, if there's a change in the type of business, you had a wedding photography business, now you stopped it to open up a restaurant, or you set up other LLCs, these can all be impactful on your status. So before you do anything major to change the business or to set up other companies, definitely talk with your attorney. Again, sometimes people have this perception that, well, I have this E2 company, I can set up other companies that do the same thing. That is not the case. The E2 is entity specific. There may be things you can do to support a structure that's more like a holding company structure, but you need to plan in advance for that, to avoid violating your status. Family business purchases. So this is permitted, but you're going to be scrutinized more closely. If you are purchasing a business from your brother, from your brother-in-law, from your sister, you want to have a valuation done of the company. That's, an objective valuation by somebody who's not related to you that shows, yes, I've paid the amount that is, reasonable for this percentage of the business. Impact of the new administration. So there's executive orders that have been put forth, none dealing directly with the E2 visa program, but dealing generally with visa issuance and with vetting of all visa applications. That's to say that any kind of issue you've had in the past, criminal issue, immigration violation, even if you were issued a visa and it wasn't an issue in the past, it could unfortunately become an issue now. They are looking at things more closely, vetting applications more closely. So you do need to kind of just be as transparent as possible with your immigration attorney so they can help prepare you for that. Higher investment and higher employee numbers. Again, nothing specific has been rolled out, but we think this will definitely help any application, and they will be looking to make sure there is a benefit to the U.S. economy. So always good to be able to show this. Similar to that, making your investments in the U.S. It's not a requirement based on the law. For example, if you purchased a computer in Canada and you have the receipt for that, you can still include it, but it's better to make the expenditures in the US if at all possible. We do note that E2 approval rates did not change much from 2016 to 2020 and, remains to be seen. But at this point, we have not seen, a major drop in approvals, although we have seen kind of longer processing times and more scrutiny on all visa applications. All right. So we do have some questions that have come in. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll run through the ones I can get through within the time. Ones that are very, very long or very, very detailed about your personal situation, I would say definitely set up a consultation with us. We would love to talk you through all of the, kind of strategy issues and assist you, but we just can't kind of quite get to that, during the webinar. So one, what is the minimum investment you'll support an application for? Do you provide business ideas? So, again, like there's no kind of minimum number. in the regulations. I think the lowest one that comes to mind that we've done is around the $25,000 mark with USCIS. I think at a consulate, I don't think that that would be successful. I think it would be very, very difficult to get that through. And for the $25,000 one with USCIS, it was a very risky case, but had a lot of other strong factors which are important for it to be approved. We do not kind of come up with business ideas for people. People come to us and have their idea, and we help them package that in a way that can be used for the E2. So we don't create the business ideas, but we do help you kind of format it and make it work for the E2. What about the runway period for the investment? If I'm opening a consulting agency and it will cost 25,000 to start the business, should I demonstrate I have sufficient funds to sustain the business? So, in terms of the E2, you have to make your substantial investment before you submit the application. You do not have to have kind of like, here's what the full amount, you don't have to have, for example, if it's going to cost $50,000 for your employee over the course of the year and, $20,000 for your lease, you don't have to show you have that amount of cash in the business bank account. But you would have to make a substantial investment before you were able to get your E2. And I think $25,000 at most consulates would be very difficult. Have we handled cases in the 20 to 40K range? How often are you seeing approvals? Applying for a couple's photography business. So we do handle cases with, as I mentioned, like we've had a USCIS filing with 25,000. We do handle cases with low amounts. If the amount spent is in kind of the 20 to 40K range, again, we try to push that up closer to 40. And then we'd also recommend getting some amount of working capital in your business bank account. So maybe you spend 40,000 and you have 20,000 in your business bank account as working capital for a total investment that we would argue of around 60,000. Um, can a photography workshop in the state be considered a business expense or included an investment amount? So again, these are kind of very, very specific questions that I would suggest that we, discuss kind of best discussed during a consultation. Generally something that you actually need to run your business can be included, but training and courses are, sometimes can be included, but are weaker expenditures. Is there any risk with a personal credit card, spending for business expenses? How can it be documented if the card isn't paid off? So we generally treat the payments on personal credit cards as unsecured lines of credit. And that has been successful. I think, don't want to have all of your expenditure based on a credit card just because they could think the business is too highly leveraged. Or then if you have paid it off, you have to show the source of funds for the money you used to pay it off. But if it's a small percentage of your investment, using a personal credit card can kind of be treated similarly to a loan. Um, Hi, I have a quick question about a team structure. Can you bring a senior team member overseas, mainly because the salary expectations are high in the US? Is it allowed, and whether their salary can be counted towards the total investment? So I think that hiring kind of a contractor or employee from outside the US, can you include it in your investment amount? Generally, yes, but it's not going to be viewed, I think, that favorably. It would be viewed much more favorably to hire someone in the US. And I would be a little concerned, again, like depending on how much of the investment it is, a little concerned that maybe it's going to give the impression, well, is this person really going to hire people in the US, which is, a big focus they have. What issues does Toronto most commonly raise in E2 interviews for small service-based businesses? They want to know, again, like, have you spent a substantial amount, right? Are you going to hire people, in the United States? So I think that's kind of a big concern for service-based businesses. If it's something kind of too small, like a small gas station with no convenience station attached, or, a post office, that only needs a part-time employee. They will ask a lot of questions to make sure that it's really, enough of a business to sustain employees in the way that are required, for the E2. And then kind of will also, of course, ask that have you spent, a substantial amount? What is your source of funds? Things like that. Someone's a Canadian citizen planning to purchase a convenience store of approximately 500,000. As per minimum requirement, I have to invest 250,000 out of that. What maximum amount I can take as a gift. So if you're planning to purchase a store for 50 or 500,000, and you're going to purchase 100%, I would say spending 250,000 generally wouldn't be enough. But that's kind of maybe a bit too granular for this discussion. Generally, the entire amount of your investment can be a gift as long as you can source it and show that it's from a legitimate source. So if you have a relative who's going to gift you the money, who's a U.S. citizen, and they're not involved in the business, they could gift you the entire amount as long as there's a legitimate source of funds. All right, so we've gone a little bit over time, but we've answered the questions. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement and your great questions. Thank you, Katie, for sharing your knowledge, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.